Hello, everyone, to the organized session number 3, the first seminar on bridging the gap between CGE and new quantitative trade models. I'll be hosting this session, and Tom will be chairing, Tom Hurdle. So over to you, Tom, for introductions. Thank you.
Yes, welcome everyone. This is the kickoff session for the 24th Annual Conference on Global Economic Analysis. So for those of you who've gotten up early in the US or staying up later in Asia, welcome to the 24th Annual Conference on Global Economic Analysis. This conference offers a great opportunity for people doing work on the quantitative analysis of global economic issues to exchange ideas, learn, and share their knowledge about issues related to theory, data, parameters, application of global economic analysis to important issues of the day. And so we're really lucky in this session to focus and have an opportunity to focus on the theoretical side of things, and in particular, bridging the work in quantitative trade, new quantitative trade modeling, in international trade, with the work underway for many decades in this community, and applied general equilibrium analysis. This particular session was organized by Anton Yang of Purdue University, and I think it really is a unique opportunity to hear from some leaders in the field about advances in this area and potential bridging between these two communities, which is a really important topic. So we're going to open with Kostas Arkolakis, a very distinguished professor of economics at Yale. He's made major contributions to trade theory and the applications of trade to the big questions of the day. I'll introduce the subsequent speakers as we go along. So Kostas, over to you. We're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, Zeynep, and Anton, for the unique opportunity, and it's a great pleasure for me to present. The talk for today is my talk for today is on the aggregate implications of firm heterogeneity. Here, this is a topic we explore is basically kind of how to estimate elasticities, non-constant elasticities in models of firm heterogeneity using some new techniques which hasn't been yet shown how to work with the potential application of GTAP models, but I think hopefully in the future we'll be able to do it soon. So this is joint work with Rodrigo Dao and many have perhaps worked on firm heterogeneity in trade, and the cornerstone of the observation in the field that led to the emergence of that field in trade is the correlation between firm outputs and trade performance. The most characteristic of those is the most productive firms are the ones that make it to export or import and so on. That led to this emergence of the merits model and subsidiary variations of firm heterogeneity. So what this paper is doing is estimate a version of the merits model without heterogeneity, and without parametric restrictions of heterogeneity, that allows us to consider things like, as I said before, non-constant elasticity of trade that many economists have criticized as being very restrictive in understanding the aggregate trade patterns. So what we will do is things like we will propose ways to estimate heterogeneity using exploiting techniques like semi-parametric identification to understand the intensive and extensive margin elasticities, and conduct non-parametric counterfactuals to understand the role of firm heterogeneity. This allows us to estimate ultimately the data with ways that are feasible, and we don't need extraordinary data requirements. Measures of rho, the assisted functions that summarize measures of firm heterogeneity, and then that will allow us to measure aggregate outcomes as a result, because we have the full model specified. So one way to think about that is kind of aspirational way of thinking about these methodologies that we developed is that how could we develop models like the GTAP or other models, applied models eventually, that are not based on the on kind of constant elasticities, but also kind of incorporate perfect heterogeneity and have like variable elasticities like extensive margin and extensive margin and so on. Of course, this hasn't been done, but it's an aspirational goal. The implications that we measure of measuring non-constant elasticity is that we can analyze the effects of heterogeneity of firms from a new micro and macro perspective. And what we find is that the role of heterogeneity as a result is non-trivial. And in particular, the aggregate implications of the non-constant elasticity are crucial for welfare gains from trade. So I'm going to go through this in detail. The model we consider, or the baseline model we consider, is the Lemons model, the constant substitution model with CS preferences, but we allow for any distribution of firm fundamentals. We can have a very rich structure there, as I will explain as I go ahead. And then what we can show is that we can derive not only the standard gravity equations. I think Don and Goethe probably have some kind of discussion of this kind of gravity equations here, but this semi-parametric gravity equations, as we will call them, for the extensive and intensive margin from level. So we kind of talk to this gravity literature, but have a kind of a little bit different approach of how to be able to estimate these gravity equations with arbitrary firm heterogeneity. So in other words, the firm heterogeneity in our context translates to different elasticities at the intensive and extensive margin. In the special case, just to set the baseline, the special case where the firm heterogeneity is assumed to be Pareto, which is a very common assumption in Lemons literature, then these extensive and intensive elasticity functions are constant. So then if you deviate from that assumption, then you have like variable elasticities. The elasticity function, what we will show is that once you estimate, once you know this elasticity function, then this is sufficient to understand all the aggregate implications of trade. So you can do non-parametric counterfactuals, you can measure fundamentally like productivity, amenity changes, different comparative statics, and so on. And we can actually, we have this kind of earlier work with Logos and Rodriguez Clare on estimating sufficient statistics for welfare gains from trade. Here we can offer an extension of these results when the elasticity functions are non-constant. So basically, all the analysis we do in the standard trade model with constant elasticity, here we can generalize with non-constant elasticity. And the final part of the paper is kind of to put into use and estimate the two elasticity functions with this kind of using frontier techniques and econometrics and do semi-parametric gravity estimation. What we will show is that one crucial feature of the data is that the aggregate elasticity is not constant, that being kind of a very common assumption in the literature. But we find that consistent with some very, very few existing evidence, that the trade elasticity falls, the aggregate elasticity falls with the volume of trade or exporter share of the data. As the extensive margin of firm exports becomes less sensitive when the trade volume is large. So this is kind of something that will guide our results for quantification, which we do for the gains from trade for the EU integration for 2004, 2015. And we find in particular that the gains from trade are underestimated for the cost elasticity benchmark when you have for some countries that have a higher share of exporter firms in this comparative study. So this is the goal. I'm gonna mostly go through the first three sections and then jump over the fourth and and quickly talk about it. So there's a little papers. I'm not gonna, in the rest of time, I'm not gonna talk in details. Let me just kind of jump to the model. Here's a standard heterogeneous firm model with n locations. I think origin, destination, I, and j. Firms are monopolistic, so each one of them is a monopolist, and it produces one variety. You can do multi-product firms. That's not a problem here for the technique. And there's a cost of production that is linear and a fixed cost of selling to each market. And the preference are CS, but that also can be generalized. We're not going to do this today. We're going to stick to the CS benchmark. So you can think of the firm demand for selling to market J as a term taste shifter via omega being the firm, and times an aggregate shifter common to all firms from I selling to J. There's a bilateral firm price, and then the elasticity demand determines the overall sales, Ri, J, omega. And there's shifters. This is the spending location J and PJ sigma minus 1, the CS price index that determines the competition in location J. The cost of the firm depends on the price. So here, this is so here you're getting basically the marginal cost of the firm. So the price will determine, so the cost will determine the price. So here's there's an iceberg cost. And exogenous, this is the common part of the iceberg cost from selling from I to J. There is a wage. There's the firm variable cost selling to J. And this is like a common component for all firms from I, times the quantity. So that's the total cost of firm selling from I to J. The variable cost, and there's a fixed cost also, but we also assume some heterogeneity. This exists. That's Fi, J, omega, and again, there's a common component. So this is basically the labor cost, the variable labor cost, and the variable fixed cost of firm omega from I selling to J. And what heterogeneity, let me summarize the heterogeneity of this model. To be like phase shifters, the productivity heterogeneity, the trade cost heterogeneity, the fixed cost. All these are things that the previous theory have incorporated in the analysis, and we just kind of now generalize it by assuming that it doesn't have a specific distribution assumption. The way that we proceed to be able to think of this extensive and intensive margin is by substituting here in the price, the marginal cost. So the price will be a markup over the marginal cost of the variable cost. So then the revenue of the firm will depend on the joint trade, the case shifter, the cost shifter, and productivity shifter of the firm. And these combined shifters, we call them the revenue potential of the firm. And the rest is stuff that you already saw from the revenue function of the firm that arises from CS demand. We also have a second object, which is the ratio of the revenue potential, this one, and the entry potential. How much is the fixed cost for each firm? And the higher this ratio, the more likely is that the firm makes enough profit to pay for the fixed cost of entry in the market. And this is just, again, indication of the assumption, CS assumption. And I'm going to call this ratio the entry potential. So the key trick here of our methodology is, and here we have we have to close the model, so we assume distributions of all this, like a generic distribution of all these shifters. And then we have the standard assumptions, market clearing, zero profit, and so on. The key thing here is that we have to assume, we just now move forward, we have to use a technique called NIO from Berry and Hale, basically building on Berry Hale or earlier work by Berry, an inversion technique that allows us to write the system of the characterized firm level exposure in terms of these gravity equations, but now this is at the firm level. So this gives you an expression of the extensive margin of the firms that is a function of the share of firm itself from I to J as a function of constants that are origin destination specific. Remember, these are the common stuff, the common fixed cost for firms from I to J, the common shifter of revenue from I to J, and these I and J are endogenous stuff potentially that are origin or destination specific. So basically, you can write an extensive margin of firm exports that is an unknown function, but we do know it's a function of the share of firms from I, let's say, J, and that these are functions of exogenous stuff and origin destination specific stuff. So the right hand side here very much looks like a gravity equation. The left hand side is non-parametric, so it's kind of has a little bit it's more generic form. And the same thing you can do for the intensive margin of the level. And again, you can show that these elements of the intensive margin have a form that depends, are functions that depend on the share of firms in its in the pair market. The slope of these firms, the slope of this intensive and extensive margin is what we will show controls all these implications of the intensive and extensive margin for the aggregates. So let me explain now how things work here, assuming that we basically know these elasticity functions and then we will eventually estimate. One thing we can do is that we can say that given changes in the fundamentals, like the average trade cost between two countries or the average fixed cost, and assuming we know data in the initial equilibrium, trade data, which is common that we have, but also the share of firms from I to J, so you can think of it like how many firms sell from Greece to the USA, or the share of Greek firms sell in the USA. And given that we know these elasticity functions that we eventually tell you how to estimate, then we can compute any counterfactual in the model, and the elasticity substitution, we can compute any counterfactual in the model for the aggregate. So for the weight, the pricing, the share of firms, the change in the share of firms, this means changes, and so on. In other words, this means that you don't need to know the specific heterogeneity, the distribution of firms, blah, blah, blah. The only thing you need to know is this aggregate function of elasticity, and you can do any counterfactual non-parametric. So then, at the end of the day, it's all about these elasticity functions. And if you know them, you can generalize them, all these kind of merits and sides by kind of measuring this elasticity function instead of having to measure the whole heterogeneity business. The second result is that heterogeneity does matter actually for welfare gains. And the way to see it is that for small change of trade costs, this is the vector of aggregates. The change in the vector of aggregates for small change in the trade cost depends only on the elasticity of substitution, the aggregate elasticity of trade, and the initial trade. So this is a version of the result we have with the biggest trade I mentioned before. So for small changes, only the aggregate elasticity matters, so not heterogeneity, not extensive and intensive marginal elasticities, but the end, the share of firms from I to J, the change of that as a function of tau does depend on the extensive marginal elasticity, and as an extension, the intensive marginal elasticity. So if you want to do large counterfactuals, you need to know the elasticity function, not only the aggregate elasticity function. If, of course, the elasticity, this elasticity changes, and that happens in the case of non-constant elasticity. So for small changes, heterogeneity only matters with the aggregate elasticities. That's a negative result about elasticity if you want, but for heterogeneity does not matter. But for large changes, we need to compute the change in theta ij that depend on the change in the nij, the share of firms for ij, and thus we also need to compute the extensive margin elasticity function. So in that case, we need to compute firm heterogeneity through computing the intensity excessive margin elasticity function. I'm just kind of flower ahead. Similar results, a similar nature result is about how to measure change in economic fundamentals. If we know the elasticity, the aggregate elasticity function, and we have the data for the trade before and after, and the number of firms before and after, then we can back out what are the shocks that generated, what are the trade cost shocks, the fixed cost shocks that generated these changes. So we can actually do kind of factuals.
2 minutes reminder.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you can actually do kind of factuals of that nature. And the final result is that we can do non-parametric sufficient statistics, assuming we know this kind of factuals. This elasticity actually. We can generalize these results for multiple sectors, zeros in bilateral trade flows, import tariffs, serious preferences, and so on. So I'm not going to show you exactly how we do this parametric gravity estimation. Like in 1 minute, that's definitely the empirical results, and 1 minute how we end up quantifying the engagement trade. So here we use very common data here on the World Liquid Output tables for trade, and we use from the World Bank data on the number of firms. Compute the firm end to share. That's the biggest requirement here. There's some other data I'm not going to go through. And we use a standard like trade distances and so on with people using trade. And just kind of to give a headline result is that the estimates of our extensive margin elasticity and intensive margin elasticity. And the extensive margin elasticity will be flat if you assume a constant elasticity, of course. But in our case, if we allow for the semi-parametric estimation, you see that the extensive margin elasticity declines with the exported firm share. The intensive margin is roughly flat. So the combination of these two gives us an elasticity of aggregate trade that declines with the firm exporter share in different markets. So this is the exporter share. Everyone exports, very few firms export, and this decline is how the fraction of firms export across different markets. And we can do this by cutting the markets like large population, small population. We can cut this different ways and estimate different elasticities. And the final thing that we do is now we kind of back out trade cost changes from 2004 to 2014 for the European Union. And then we estimate the gains from trade in the European Union by recovering the changes, the fixed cost and the variable cost, and seeing who gained from the European Union integration. And this is kind of, there's some interesting results that we find that basically the East European countries gain the most, but the West European countries that were already in the Union gain less or even sometimes generated losses. So to summarize, and you can see the rest of the details in the paper, we found that the distribution of fundamentals in these models generically determines the elasticity of the extensive and intensive margin from exports as a function of the exporter firm share. And you can use these non-constant elasticity functions to analyze and measure these functions to understand aggregate trade implications in all these models, the Merits class. And the future plan is to analyze a mini indexing version of non-constant elasticities, or we kind of closer to variations of the GTAP model. So kind of try to understand these models better to see how they are connected to the more applied literature to this realistic and factual evaluation of the. Thank you very much.
Tom, you're muted.
Thanks, Kostas. Really interesting presentation. You've whetted my appetite to read the paper, and I hope others will also. So we do have time for discussion here. I think it's a super important paper for us as we look forward in this community about how to quantify the gains from trade, this idea that we're not in a world of constant elasticities, and these margins do depend on market penetration. I think really important points, and I think intuitive for those who work more on the empirical side. It just makes sense. Questions from the audience. You're free to come off mute if you wish to ask a question or add something in the chat. While we're waiting for someone to jump in, Kostas, can you say something more about when you add trade and intermediates? I know it sounds like you've generalized this, but obviously then potentially the fixed and variable costs change at different rates. A number of things get more complicated, and obviously that is the main channel we're looking at in GTAP when we're looking at trade liberalization, is lowering the cost of intermediates, say, relative to fixed costs. Could you say something about that generalization, Kostas?
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, first of all, thanks for a very nice summary of about market penetration and elasticity. I like the way you said it. We haven't executed, so that I give you some intuition of like how the gains change and so on. So we haven't executed this extension, but all the crucial step for doing this technique of writing the extensive and intensive margin of the model is this inversion technique that I mentioned earlier. So as long as you can replicate that step in the methodology, everything else goes through. And with input output, there is no problem about that, because this is just at the marginal cost of the firm. Right? So, and of course, you have the input output tables already in the data, so you don't need to do anything else once you have that. So that's kind of a straightforward extension.
Well, that's great to hear, actually. So questions from the audience? Does someone want to jump in? Take a stiff drink of coffee, folks on the East Coast, and you're welcome to chime in on this.
Tom, Roberta is, okay. I think she raised her hand.
Yeah, Roberta. I can't see the hands, so you'll have to monitor them, Zeynep.
Yes.
Roberta, please jump in.
It took me a while to find out how to raise my hand, and I didn't realize you had to go to participants to do that. Just a quick question. When you showed what the determinants of the extensive margin at the firm level, I wonder, I mean, now there is a lot of discussion and firms diversifying following this shock due to COVID. So is there a way in which, for instance, in the analysis, either it's already included or it could be included, sort of a potential choice of firms or factor that would affect the diversification of firms because of increased perceived risk of relying on a few destination markets, for example?
So you mean if we can? So this is like the basically ending uncertainty in this work. Is this what you're?
Yeah, or a sense of is there a way in which we could sort of interpret any of the costs there as a sense, what is the perception of a risk? And therefore, of course, uncertainty is the way we go, but maybe one could simply consider it a cost or not?
Yeah, and there is some new work on uncertainty and trade. There are I can cite some papers that are very nice. We haven't thought of this carefully, how we will work, but there's definitely a possibility. And I mean, the data requirements of the uncertainty are not bigger than what we have. They just use the Mellis model and the uncertainty. but we haven't explored how our techniques will work there, but definitely kind of something that in the future thinking about. Yeah. Thank you.
Costas, when Roberta said diversification, that tweaked something in my mind. I mean, if you think about a firm potentially moving into multiple markets, obviously their penetration increases here. The interest, there's a natural interest in diversifying into an underserved where they aren't as deeply penetrated. Have you thought about that? I mean, it's obviously a great.
I see. Now I understand. Sorry, I was confused. Yeah, so here you also mean that the markets are interdependent, right? So then you kind of want to, right. So there's actually, in that case, you can actually, there is an extension of this managed model that work. You need to kind of think of all these combinatorial possibilities of which market do you combine and so on. And there is a way to incorporate this in the model as well. But again, that's not something we thought through. Federico Esposito at Taft has a paper about I know of how to do diversification of selecting combinations of markets so you kind of diversify the risk. That's again something we haven't explored, but it's definitely something we can put in these models.
Caleb, do you have a question?
I'm raising. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Kostas. I think having more empirical research on the elasticities is very important to get these Melis versions of CGE and quantitative trade models used for policymaking. And I wanted to ask you, when we have these non-constant elasticities in the models, could you comment on the tractability of the models? Should we take an eye on the theory, or are there any issues with the tractability to be able to use them in policy? Thank you.
Yeah, so plowing through all these results we have been trying to derive, basically tractability is exactly the same as the method. Like you can derive comparative statics with sufficient statistics. You can do you can compute these models basically the same way as fast as you can compute. So the big question is if you have enough data to estimate the elasticities every time. And I think that's where the stumbling block would be using these techniques. But for every other purpose, mathematically, analytically, these models are not much different. I mean, I show you sufficient statistics results. We just have to, these are all conditioning on all these elasticities.
Thank you.
One more question from the audience before we move on. Thank you so much.
That's excellent. Thanks so much for your questions.
I'm excited to read the paper. I think this just taking us, we have been prisoners of convenience, CES, Pareto, these assumptions that are tractable, but maybe don't hold up empirically. I think moving us beyond that is huge. So thank you for guiding the way on that. And I think for those doing policy analysis, as Zeynep says, this is going to be, I think, will fall on receptive ears. So excellent, a great way to kick this session off. And we will have, just a reminder to everyone, we have ample time for discussion at the end. So as you think about this, Roberta will kick off the discussion, and then we'll have time for general discussion across these papers. So thank you. The second speaker is Anton Yang. He's just received his PhD at Purdue. He's also the organizer of this session and an enthusiastic proponent of bridging new quantitative trade modeling with CGE analysis. Anton is also all about non-homotheticity in trade, in case you didn't know that. So you're going to hear more about that here. Anton, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. So I'll first make the full screen. So is this full screen to everyone now? Okay, thank you. So thanks everyone. And the paper that I'm going to present today is actually my job market paper, which I've worked in the past few years. And the title of this paper is called "A Structural Estimation of a Gravity Model of Trade with the Constant Difference of Elasticities," or the CDE, which I'll talk about later on. So this is a paper which integrates some demand theory in the gravity model, which helps study some other perspective which otherwise would not be reviewed, in my view, in the traditional gravity model. All right, so so what is gravity model? Although I think everyone knows about it, and I just want to make a small summary. So gravity model is a model which studies the patterns of trade flows using the size of bilateral distances and partner sizes. And essentially, the gravity model can be said, you can perceive the gravity model as demand, fact demand model, in which the demand for the factor, in fact, foreign factor service is zero if the demand for using the factor produce the goods is zero. So, which means it's important to study the demand system in a gravity model. But the traditional gravity model in the literature, existing literature, typically use the CES, which is constant elasticity of substitutions, and so that implies the unitary income elasticity, which means the effects on national fact demands are actually proportional to the change in the income. So given there has been I say substantial growth when we look at the data, wild data in the world. So we want to say so whether the gravity model are still appropriate in the existing literature. If not, what are some other models that can be used to study? So it's traditionally the CS gravity models are constructed in a way that conforms the called non-empirical relationship, and it's actually hard to challenge the gravity theory, challenge the CS gravity theory. So one way to test the theory of the CS gravity is to bring the theory of non-homotheticity, which allows the relative demand for imported factor to be affected by the change in income. So in this paper, I will introduce a general demand model, which actually nests a CSM model. And in the empirical sense, estimation strategy actually helps to find initial values of initialization of the CDE model, which help to achieve identification. All right, so in this paper, I will also actually test the CD, the more general model, against the less restricted models, including the CS model, and also using the out of sample predictions. Another important contribution in this paper is that I was able to use my estimation strategy to separate the trade costs from the trade responses. So there have been not a lot, but several demand non-homothetic demand that have been used in gravity model, which I will just summarize them into this table. The first one is standard gravity literature, which uses the standard CS demand system, which is the most thin demand system in the gravity model. And there is this AIDS model used in Fagerbaum Cannerwell paper, and that's a model invented by Deaton and Muehlbauer, which is a family of demand model which applied approximations can be to the expenditure function, utility function. So these models typically work pretty well in the small number of goods but the problem is when the number of goods start to increase, and as noted in Hannock, demand theorist, the usefulness of these type of demand models are tend to diminish. To as the Zeynep, did you ask a question?
Sorry, it was just left. Yeah, right.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, so the usefulness of these models tend to diminish if the number of goods becomes large, because the n number of goods are associated with n square parameters. So there's okay. So one way to reduce the parameter space is to introduce the separability assumption, and which are included in all these papers down below. And the Fuller lady, H.O. Samnowska, so they use the explicit model. One is directly explicitly additive model, is the other one is indirectly explicitly additive model. So I will talk about the terminologies in several next slides, and so I'll just go on with this terminology for now. So these models are parsimonious. They have a small number of goods. They work for a small and large number of goods, and they are so they're simple, and these models are non-CS. But so one drawback of this model is that it does not separate the substitution effect from income effects. And so in gravity, basically it means the factor demand across all factor demands, they have so the all factor demands, they have the peculiar substitutability regardless of what we see from the data. And so one model that we see in this table, there are several other models in the literature now, but one representative paper is by Coleman, Lashkari, Mistieri, and so they introduced the implicit additivity into their paper, and that helps that is consistent with what's talked about in demand theory in Hannock, which separates the substitution effect from income effects. But another drawback from their paper is that implied by the name, non-homothetic CES, which means the model is still a CES model, meaning that the factors factor substitutabilities are uniform and constant. So this paper basically introduced CDE, which is implicitly indirect model, and which will capture all the advantages above. So what is implicitly additive? And have not talked about this before. The model, if it's called to be implicitly additive, if it can be expressed in one of the two forms above. So it can be directly additive or indirectly additive. So if it's implicitly directly additive, if the isoquant is additive in consumer goods, and if it's indirectly additive, it means that the indifference curve is additive in unit cost price, or this P over E. And so the basic meaning of the implicity is that so the utility cannot be cleanly solved in terms of models exogenous variables and parameters. So here is the CDE function finally, and that's first introduced by Hannock in 1975. This is called implicitly additive demand defining equation, and that's implicit indirectly additive. So there are 3 n parameters, which are the beta, which is taste and distribution parameters, and the expansion parameter EI, which governs non-homotheticity, and there's alpha I, which is partial substitution elasticities, which governs both the income and price elasticities. All right, so so this model is parsimonious, and it does separate substitution effect from income effects, and it allows complementarities and inferior goods. So one other feature which is helpful in the estimation procedure is that the CDE actually nests several other demand systems. So we can see if we allow the alpha I to be for every goods, and the CDE model will collapse to a non-homothetic CES. And if we further allow the EI, all the EI to be 1, and the CDE model will just collapse all the way to the standard CES model. So the demand model built into the gravity model is conceptually similar to Anderson and Van aggregate trade flows, except that I'll introduce CDE in the gravity model using the estimation procedure following Balistreri and Hilbrey, who used the MPAC procedure to estimate the model for Anderson Van with the U.S. Canadian data. Okay, so if we derive, from here we can actually derive the Higgsonian or Marshallian, the quasi Marshallian demand, and using that demand formula to construct the empirical gravity equation. So if we look at this equation here, the last the term in the square bracket can be corresponded to modulated resistance as discussed in Anderson and the Van model. And the key point is that if we can control for modulated resistance in this empirical form of gravity, and we can estimate alpha if we know the data on the income and the data on population. But the problem is though, if we don't know the cardinal value of utility, and we would not get information about the EI, expansion parameter. But if we do get the alpha I and know EI, and we'll estimate the rho, because so as standard regression will give us the coefficients in front of the distance data, log distance. But in this theoretical empirical form, we cannot estimate utility if we follow reduced form approaches. So this is where I will use MPAC program to control for modulated resistance and estimate utility, and at the same time estimating other parameters, structural parameters in the model using the equilibrium constraints and non-equilibrium constraints as well. So one of the specific equilibrium constraints that's not kind of non-standard is actually the implicit utility defining equation, which is equation 3. Except as you can see, so this model looks isomorphic to the Handout type of model, except we have these the gravity forms here, and there's also a derived cost of utility. And I just want to bring up, what I think is important to know is that cost of utility in these non-homothetic models are not equalized to the average price index for goods for example, in CS models. They are not equal. So we cannot use the standard estimation procedure in general equilibrium, which have these, you can model the income balance, income definitions using the average price index goods, but with cost of price index, you cannot use that. And that has a complementarity variable, and which can be used in both counterfactuals and the estimation with the MPAC. Okay, so there's the endowments of goods equation. So this is a quantity, initial fixed quantity of goods. The fixed quantity of goods in I just equals to the demand from the world for I's goods. And if you multiply the quantity of goods by the price or FOB price here, I will get the income definition. And this is the equation 6 is standard in many other CS gravity models. And there's the utility function, which is the benchmark utility equation. And the phi over here can be seen as the elasticity of elasticity of aggregate expenditure with respect to utility. So as I said earlier, the CDE model nests several other demand systems if we allow the expansion parameter to equal to 1 for all goods, and that will become a CS model or standard CS model. And if E is 1 and this is budget share, so all of these things will collapse to 1, and we'll just get U equals to income over price index. So that's the standard, the CES income balance condition. In this model, I also introduced a it's called equation 8. It's the I assume the labor for simplicity. Labor is the only factor in the model and assumed to be fixed, and also introduce a fee parameter as the productivity parameter, which is Ricardian union labor requirement. So introduction of fee is just to capture the cross-country differences in the gap between wage and prices, and allow the income and the GDP to be different in non-homothetic models. So if we divide the income definition and the labor market clearance condition, I will automatically get the implied zero profit condition for firms. All right, so the estimation procedure I'll use the PPML estimator, which is pretty standard, mainly majorly in this case, just to deal with the possible zero trade flows. In my estimation, I actually have one country that there's a 1-0 trade flow in 1995 in the aggregate version, and then I can write the constraint optimization problem, and my objective function can be written using the PPML estimator. And there's equilibrium constraints that discussed earlier, and also the structure parameter regularity conditions. Okay, so here is the parameter estimator table, and we can see that the CS now, that static CS, they have the alpha, which is corresponding to sigma in the standard literature. So we can see that they are both in the neighborhood of 5. And one thing we can note is that when we shift the CS model to non-homothetic CS model, the trade costs, which is rho here, is the elasticity of distance, or distance elasticity, and the delta, these deltas are the border coefficients, are a proxy for trade costs. So they actually get smaller. But if we shift from non-homothetic CS to CDE model using the same data, we actually see the rho and delta are increased across all regions. So I went to my results. So there are other detailed results not for this table, which I find that so if you're taking the importer's vision, seeing all goods coming from
2 minutes reminder. Sorry, Anton, 2 minutes.
About that, thank you. Yeah, and so over here, I want to deliver the last message is there's a higher trade cost associated with the substitutabilities, lower substitutabilities between domestic countries and the exporting countries. And also the likelihood ratio test is what's promised, and I implemented the likelihood ratio test and calculated the the degree of freedom between the two models for each for 2 degree of freedoms, and take the difference. And I was able to reject both nulls that CS, non-homothetic CS, are more consistent with the data. And so that says that CDE is a better model in precisely in this gravity model of aggregate trade flows in terms of fitting to the data. All right, so I think I want to spend more time to talk about a little bit my unpack counterfactual method, because this is the implicit indirect model has not been estimating gravity before. So I encounter challenge, and other people can well encounter challenge as well when they look at the income balance condition, which in fact is kind of redundant in the complementarity slackness problems. So sometimes so that we don't know what is the complementarity variable that needs to pin down for the implicit utility model where utility is not explicitly defined. So in this case, so I find a very clean way to do the counterfactuals, which I can, first step is just standard step, just estimate the model. I'll build the model first and estimate the model using historical data. And then the second step, of course, before even any actual counterfactuals, I do the check of existence of a general equilibrium and use MPAC to do it. So people may wonder that MPAC has the objective function, but MCP, the mixed complementarity problem, to pin down the complementarity variables do not have an objective function. But in fact, there's a kind of pseudo value of likelihood that can be fitted exactly to the data and the predicted, which is the estimated parameters. So I can replicate the initial equilibrium, and when I shift the parameter numeraire, and this time I can free up the value of likelihood, which allows, presumably there's a change in residuals between the model's initialization and counterfactuals. And the step 3 is to estimate the consequence of counterfactuals, which is conceptually similar. This script J is the value of likelihood. So the first step to constrain the value of likelihood estimate from original problem to be to the one which I will calibrate first in the initial equilibrium, and then release the restriction and estimate the counterfactual. Yeah. All right. So yeah. So there's counterfactual exercise. One exercise is that I compare the CD and CS, and the first analytical message is that the CD and CS are different, and I don't know how to describe bars, but we see that there's no variation with change in trait flows. These are represent CS model, and so these are just unrealistic. These patterns are peculiar, and which do not. I'm sure that they do not represent the real counterfactuals that are not even close to counterfactuals. Whereas the CD generates some positive and negative results, and in terms of the change in trait flows. All right, so over here, I just want to, because this is a GTAP conference, I really think this is relevant to the GTAP and also to the quantitative trait modelers. So this is the GTAP equation, which is exactly the same as this one. So one advantage of using the GTAP type in counterfactuals is that at least one major advantage, I think, is to provide a very intuitive decomposition, and that's clear to everyone, a modeler who analyzes. So this helps us to know, for example, the CS model, the income elasticities, and over here, this is a change of income. See, the population actually goes away. So this is universal Mann equation, which means the non-homothetic CS will give the extra income effects due to the change in population, whereas income effects are largely moved out if income elasticity is one with the CS model.
Anton, I think you've exceeded your time.
Okay, I'm almost done. Yeah, sure. Sorry, this is very rare that I haven't managed to finish the presentation.
Actually, why don't you come back to this in the discussion and the Q&A?
Okay.
I think we've gone over. Let's open it to discussion and questions. I wanted to make one observation that this is a good example of. So we've been talking about the theme of this session is the interplay between CGE analysis, the GTAP community, and the new quantitative trade modeling community, and more generally the stuff going on in empirical and theoretical trade. This is an example of kind of the information flow going back the other direction. The CDE is something that the GTAP community has been using for 3 decades. Because of its flexibility in representing important income effects, as well as some more generality in substitution effects. As Anton said, some flexibility there is important empirically. So it's interesting that Anton's found a way to bring this into the gravity literature and shed additional light on that. I think just more interplay at this margin between the two communities would be very beneficial. So are there questions for Anton? Costas.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find how to raise my hand. Yeah, so it's a very, very nice presentation. I'm fascinated how we can estimate all this, the alphas, right? The alphas. What is the thing that identifies the alphas intuitively in the data that you can estimate one per country? Can you tell us an insight?
Yeah, so normally we cannot identify alpha because we run regression. We don't, at least we don't know value here. So I use the MPAC. The model ladder resistance at the same time estimate the utility cardinal value of utility, and so here the income and the population are just data, and the utility is controlled for, and I can estimate alpha with the distance data over here. But normally, yeah, we run regression as other people do the double log differencing. I will not be able to estimate it, but this is where the MPAC has been useful to me.
Is it helping you to fit some data? The difference? Are there different alphas? Like what's intuitively? What's maybe I exceeded my time for question with the data.
Yes, it estimated ability, and there's some relation data way that can aid the application.
Anton, I'm not hearing you well. Can you kill your video for a second and respond to the question? You're breaking up, at least on my side. Can you kill your video and answer Costas's last question again? Because I wasn't hearing it. Okay.
Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Better now. Okay. So normally it's it's impossible to estimate alpha without knowing utility, and so when we estimate the equation, and normally economists don't worry about utility itself, they worry about the welfare, etc. But they do not estimate utility, although they have probably estimated everything else that needed to calculate utility in the CS model. So in the gravity model with CDE, I found that if we can first estimate the utility, know the utility for the given data, and the trait matrix, the trait matrix, we can identify alpha if using the MPAC approach. But this cannot be successfully estimated using the reduced form.
Okay. One time for one more question. Is there? Yes, Russ, over to you.
Yeah, Anton, I think you didn't do the out of sample prediction, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about. You showed us the effect of an increase in income in China, and that you had more difference in your model than the other. But how can you show us whether that's sort of empirically better than the CES in terms of predicting trade out of sample?
Yeah, sure. So I wasn't able to finish the last second slides. So because there's so when we saw the second counterfactual exercise where the CS model does not produce any variations in terms of trade flows when there are income and population shocks given to China, when we see China as importer, and that means that for the CDE model, if we regress the actual import shares on the prediction for shares and get coefficient, that means the model is actually predictive. And I was able to do that empirically and estimate using the parameter estimates and do the counterfactuals, and then estimate and then run the regression of the actual shares in the database on the CDE predicted import shares, and the coefficient is actually 0.31. So that was very impressive, because if we do this for, we basically will not get anything, because as we saw, the CS does not generate the variations in trade flows whatsoever, which means the CC, which is the strong sign that CD is empirically important and more useful than the CS model.
Okay, thanks for that, Anton. It's time to move on to our next speaker. So it's a real pleasure to have here Yoto Yotov, professor of economics at Drexel University and also at the IFO Institute in Munich. And Yoto's a great and articulate advocate of gravity. And when I first heard him talk, I thought we've got to get him to the GTAP conference. So thanks, Anton, for getting Yoto here. We look forward to hearing about nested gravity without apology. Over to you, Yoto.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. Very good. So first of all, thank the organizers for this great conference. The other two presenters, amazing presentations, great papers. Anton, thank you so much for organizing the session. And Tom, thanks for the kind introduction. The real reason Tom recommended me to Anton here is because in gravity size matters, and I'm the largest of all my co-authors. So that's why I am actually here. So before I start the presentation, a couple of notes on it. First of all, I think that, I mean, for sure, this is a more kind of general presentation rather than a specific paper. It includes a few different papers, and this is a condensed version of a keynote talk that I gave a few weeks ago based on several papers by many people, but from my co-authors, Jim Anderson and Mario Larch. What is also special about this talk is that when creating it, I used the opportunity to excite my little son, who is 10-year-old, and he really likes green characters and heroes. So I used the opportunity to excite him about gravity a little bit. And also, finally, the original title that I sent was Nested Gravity, and to it, I have added, as you can see on the slide, without apology. And this without apology comes from a title of a recent paper by a brilliant economist and an amazing human being, Peter Neary, who unfortunately we recently lost. And Peter and I earlier this year had many exchanges about gravity. And even though he only recently started working intensively in gravity, I learned so much from him. So I dedicate this talk to him. So I'm going to start with a fairly standard statement, and Tom already made a disclaimer for me. The gravity equation is very often regarded as the most popular and most successful framework in international economics. And to back this up, I'm going to use a slide which was actually used by Peter Neary himself in one of his presidential addresses, where he noted that the gravity equation is probably the only equation, econometric model, that has found its place on the first page of the Financial Times. So I'm going to expand on Peter's slide actually by enlarging this equation and noting that it is actually wrong. It is misspecified, and while we can excuse the popular press with such mistakes or misspecifications, unfortunately, very often we see gravity equations in academic papers that are misspecified and do not take into account some major theoretical and empirical developments, or in other words, in the words of Leonardo da Vinci, it is like estimating gravity without a solid foundation in theory. It's like a sailor who leaves shore without a rudder and a compass and never knows where he may cast. So with this intuition, my motivation here and under the overall topic is to review the evolution of the gravity model over time while highlighting many of its great features, clarifying some misconceptions, demonstrating the benefits of doing theory-consistent work. And here, in particular, I think is where I'm going to put emphasis on bridging gravity, on new quantitative trade models with the GTAP literature. And then, wherever possible, I'm going to use the opportunity to discuss cutting-edge research. And I'm very excited. I have seen it a couple of times, Kostas's paper, and I also look forward to read Anton's paper more carefully as well. So my disclaimer is that, my presentation is subject to a lot of home bias, but I'm going to be happy to defend everything I say along the way or at the end during the discussion. So I'm going to split the rest of the presentation in 4 major parts, plus at the end some potential extensions. So I'm going to start by what is known to most people as a naive gravity reduced form equation, and I'm going to discuss why do people like gravity. And on that front, I think there are 3 main reasons. First of all, the model is extremely intuitive. Just like in physics, the bigger and the closer objects are, the more they attract each other. In trade, the bigger and the closer countries are, the more they trade with each other. Of course, initially we borrowed gravity from physics, but unlike physics, where 80% of what they are interested in is dark matter, gravity actually predicts about 80% of what we are interested in on a regular basis. And then this brings me to the next slide. The next main reason why people, even those who are not really familiar with theory or sophisticated estimations, why they like gravity is because it works. It works with aggregate data, it works with sectoral data, it works with manufacturing goods, services, even mining. And importantly, gravity delivers the same fit without any fixed effects, which of course differentiates it, for example, from the Minserian regression, which has fixed effects to deliver good fit. Finally, the gravity framework is very flexible. This is the 3rd reason why most people like it. Literally thousands of papers have used the gravity framework to estimate the effects of different determinants of trade. Some of them are what I label traditional, like trade policy and distance, geography, etc. Some are more exotic, such as reputation, institutional quality, mega sporting events, etc., etc. So to sum up this first part, I think the main 3 reasons why the general population likes the gravity model is that it is intuitive, it works, and it is quite flexible. So at this point, I mentioned already the green heroes and my son. I told him, well, listen, the gravity framework is like Shrek. It is intuitive, it delivers the job, and this is why people like it. And then when I was reading, Shrek stories with him, I realized that Shrek's character is described actually as a very insecure one who sought recluse from everyone, and everybody judged him as a monster before they knew him. And it took a long time before Shrek won the heart of Princess Fiona. So similarly, on the gravity side, gravity, as summarized by Baldwin and Taglioni, gravity fell into disrepute or sought recluse in the 70s and 80s. And then instead of a monster, Jim Anderson, who's the father of gravity, calls it an intellectual orphan. And it took more than 50 years for really gravity to win the hearts of trade economists. So now I think at this stage, most people are convinced in the solid theoretical foundations and great performance of gravity. Yet, even among some academics, we see some disbelief. And this is a quote from a referee report that we received after the famous ACR paper, after Ethan Kortum, after Anderson van Winkoop. Still, some academic trade economists actually believe that the gravity equation is just a reduced form naive equation and there is not much theory there. So to address this critique, actually, I'm just going to say that gravity actually has very solid theoretical foundations, and it has many, many theoretical foundations in addition. So this brings me to the next point, which is the rise of structural gravity, the so-called new quantitative trade models. So to present this, I'm going to start with a slide that has a couple of inconsistencies. As we know, the proverb says, all roads lead to Rome. I'm showing you a picture of Paris, and I'm going to argue that all roads lead to gravity. And this is indeed the case. You can start with Armington CES, Ricardian, Heckscher-Ohlin, monopolistic competition, heterogeneous firms, Ricardian with sectors and intermediates, or if you want just sectoral links on the demand side, and even with dynamics, and they all converge to exactly the same system, which is this one. The first is the structural gravity equation. Next, we have the famous multilateral resistances of Anderson and van Wynkoop. And finally, we have the market clearing condition, which importantly, I mean, for this audience, it's needless to say, when you do sound G analysis or CGE analysis, of course, the market clears by taking into account domestic trade flows here, in addition to international trade flows. It turns out, as I'm going to argue a little bit later, that proper account of domestic trade flows actually has significant implications for quantification of the effects of very important country-specific policies and converting them into ad valorem equivalents, which in turn are important for general equilibrium analysis. So without going into details, because I'm pressured by time, I'm just going to show you several derivations with the same notation from Anderson and Anderson van Wynkoop, but based on different micro foundations. So this is the demand side standard gravity system, which Anton referred to. Then if we derive it with the same notation from Eaton and Kortum, the difference is in orange. We have theta, the dispersion Frechet parameter, which captures the dispersion of comparative advantage. We can derive sectoral gravity where the superscript K appears. We can derive it with firms and sectors where we have, of course, fixed costs and heterogeneous productivities. We can derive it with country-specific dynamic effects. We can also derive it with bilateral dynamic effects. So each of these systems has implications for estimation, for quantification potentially, and some of the additional equations are omitted, but the important message is that they all lead subject to parameter interpretation, as argued by Arkoulakis et al. 2012, they lead to exactly the same system. In fact, trade economists nowadays are so used to and agree on this system that one of our major concerns or academic trade war is whether we use NI or IJ as a bilateral subscript when we describe the gravity system. So one thing that is in addition important to just saying gravity has many theoretical foundations is that these theoretical foundations actually have very important implications for estimation. And I don't have the luxury of time to go over this equation, which I believe is kind of a cutting edge estimating gravity equation. If there are questions later, I can address them, but I want to put emphasis on two things. It is extremely important, and I was very happy to see Anton relying on Russ's procedure to control for the multilateral resistances. We know that it is extremely important to properly control for the resistances when we estimate gravity. And unfortunately, many papers, not only from other fields, but from our own field, still do not do this. And the other thing is that, as I mentioned before, based on the market clearance condition, when we estimate gravity consistent with theory and now data are available, we should use domestic trade flows, because with the use of domestic trade flows, within the same structural specification, we can identify the effects of country-specific and non-discriminatory trade policies, such as sanitary and phytosanitary standards, technical barriers to trade, which are extremely important nowadays, as we know, in the trade policy. And this will allow us to convert them into ad valorem tariff equivalents, which can be plugged into more complicated CGE frameworks. So based on this, I'll conclude this section by saying that gravity has solid theoretical foundations, and they have a number of nice empirical implications: improve the fit, deliver better gravity estimates, solve prominent puzzles, such as the Canadian border puzzle, for example, and address certain estimation challenges, such as obtaining the effects of country-specific trade policy. And what is nice about this is that this means, back to my son, is that gravity is smart, and this is one of the smartest green characters that I was able to identify for him. And in addition, all the previous properties that I mentioned, which are nice, intuitive and flexible, remarkable predictive power, they still remain into this structural gravity setting. So from a naive estimating equation, now gravity combines the best of both worlds, and it is a structural estimating equation. Of course, many of us who do gravity have faced these questions. I have seen it in many seminars, and I have received at least a dozen emails about this. Well, I want to evaluate this and that. Shall I use gravity or shall I use a CGE? My short answer to this is that the gravity model is a CGE model itself. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to start with the system that I just showed has many different theoretical foundations. First, I'm going to replace the market clearing condition with the corresponding expression from Anderson and Van Wynkoop. And then I'm going to link expenditure and income with, for now, later we can endogenize trade imbalances, but an exogenous country-specific aggregate trade imbalance. So now this system can be decomposed into three channels. The first is a partial equilibrium. The second is a conditional general equilibrium. It is a general equilibrium because through this channel, every country in the world will be affected by trade liberalization by one or two other countries. But it is conditional because size here is still exogenous. And then the final channel, which I'm going to label full endowment general equilibrium, will endogenize size, but I label it endowment because size is endogenous at this point, at least, only through prices. So now real quick, if two countries sign a free trade agreement, all else equal, they're going to trade more with each other, presumably because they eliminate trade barriers. However, because they operate in the world trading system, this will lead to potentially trade diversion effects from other countries. And then for these countries that are left out, they, among themselves, they're going to trade more. So these are captured by the multilateral resistances for the consumers and for the producers. And this is a general equilibrium effect because everybody in the world, there is going to be trade diversion. So presumably, potentially, everybody in the world will be affected by these changes. Next, if here the outward multilateral resistance is interpreted as the shipping costs for the producers in a liberalizing country, they of course are going to endogenize part of it. You can think of the factory gate price P now as a wage. Income size of the country will increase. And then through this increase in size, in the price, the size of the country will be larger and this country will trade more with everybody else, including its trading partner. It turns out that these size effects, and I remember, I don't know if Kostas remembers this, a while ago it was a conference in Greece and he asked me, well, can these effects dominate the diversion effects? Actually, we have some evidence when we simulated TTIP that these size effects actually can dominate the trade diversion effects through the multilateral resistances. And importantly for quantifying trade policy analysis, as is well known to this group, but sometimes we see not very well known to some policymakers, if we don't take into account the trade diversion effects and just rely on gravity to quantify, partial effects, we could be up to 50% of the actual trade policy impact. And finally, size effects matter as well for your standing in the world trading system. The bigger you are due to trade liberalization, the bigger you weight in the multilateral resistance system, and this is captured here. So this is just a demonstration that the gravity system can be used for, let's call them benchmark general equilibrium analysis. But at this stage, it gets a little bit better because actually every single one of these equations can be estimated, which has a number of additional advantages. To show this, I'm just going to replace the endowment with standard Cobb-Douglas production function, exogenous factors of production for now. Then I'm going to replace the factory gate price into this equation. And now the first equation is the gravity equation, which can be estimated in many different ways. The second two are the multilateral resistances, which we don't need software now. I mean, they can be just estimated directly as well. And then the final equation corresponds, this is the income equation, corresponds to the famous Franco and Romer trade and growth equation. The difference is that instead of exports here in Franco-Romer, we have this theoretical term, and it has two advantages. One is, this is the outward multilateral resistance. We can account for some of the endogeneity concerns explicitly. And second, the famous trade elasticity that we know from the ACR is so important for our welfare analysis. We can recover it directly from this income slash macro equation. Of course, I should know, and this relates to a question that Tom had and Kostas responded. Once we move to disaggregated estimations and input-output linkages, we may face some constraints in terms of how far we can push this ECGE, Estimating Computable General Equilibrium Framework. But as long as we have certain conditions or certain restrictions, invertibility in particular, I think we can push further in this direction. And this is an area where I think further progress can be made. So to summarize,
sorry, Otto, 2 minutes reminder.
Can I have 2.5?
Absolutely.
So gravity has the nice properties of CGE. It delivers structural parameters, allows us to test for causal relationship, and uncovers new estimation opportunities. So its power, I told my son, it's like the Hulk now. We can also do CGE analysis while retaining all the previous properties. So from this structural estimating equation, now we are moving to an estimating CGE model that combines the best of all worlds. And then this is personal correspondence with a dear friend who's a top CGE economist. He says, yeah, you can do these things, but it is still small scale. So my response to him was, well, you're correct. And here is how I think about gravity, again, relying on a paper with of Costas with Ala and Takahashi. So I think of the gravity system that I just showed you as this universal engine, where the fuel are different trade policies that can vary at the bilateral dimension, and is the number of countries, and they can also be country specific. What the structural gravity or new quantitative trade models do for us is they collapse this dimension into two indexes per country, one on the consumers, one on the producers. And what this means is that once we have this clean transition from bilateral to country specific indexes, this means that we can conveniently integrate gravity within a number of labor, investment, environment, resource model where there is a lot to learn from the GTAP literature. So my last point here is just to demonstrate a couple of examples for this. So if we start with the structural gravity system as we know it, we can perform general equilibrium analysis with it relatively easy. And this is now standard, even Stata can do it for us. But we can nest it into a model of investment by endogenizing physical capital. We can also introduce intermediates, and we can even incorporate FDI. So what is nice is that the original gravity system in all these extensions, it remains the same, so we can take advantage of all the nice properties. And in fact, at least in these settings that I'm showing you, every single one of these equations can be estimated. So gravity can be nested within many models. The resulting system is still tractable and transparent, and often the new GE equations can be estimated, all at the same time where the previous nice properties were remain valid. So at this point, I was left out of green heroes. So what I did for my son here, I just added the sign for Supergirl, and I said, well, now you can nest gravity within all these great frameworks, and you can do more things with it. So I'm going to finish with quote from Peter Neary in one of our last exchanges, where he said, gravity is endless fun. I told him that I'm going to use it in my slides. He was happy about this. So it turns out that despite great success and popularity, there are still a lot of opportunities for improvement. And the two papers that we saw today, I think this is a nice transition and fits very well with the conference message. The non-parametric gravity of Costas here and the preferences that Anton talked about. I mean, these are just two examples how the GTAP literature and the structural gravity literature can benefit from each other. There are many others that I can discuss. I think that it is very important for us to take advantage of improvement in econometric techniques on the estimation side and better data that we have, while at the same time, learn from decades of investments and very elegant GTAP frameworks. And to conclude, I'm just going to quote my son, who after 2 days of drawing green animals concluded that gravity is cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoto. I look forward to meeting your son someday. Thanks for bringing that light dimension into our morning or evening, as the case may be. That's a very engaging talk. Thank you. So we have time for some questions specific to Yoto before we move to the general cross-cutting discussion led by Roberta. Any questions from the audience? Zainab, will you keep an eye on people raising hands or whatnot? I think also if you come off mute and wave at me, I will see you as well. Kostas, over to you. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I still haven't figured out how to raise the hand. But yeah, Yoto, I mean, this is really cool and keeps improving like every time I see it. So, so can you tell me, I was fascinated by this number you said if you ignore the multilateral resistance. Did you say, did I get it correct? If you ignore the multilateral resistance, you lose like 50% of them. Can you kind of break down this for me? Like,
Yeah. Thanks, Costa. And, as you saw, big part of this presentation has been inspired by your work. So thanks for this. And, I'm still wrapping my hand around some of the things in your latest paper to try to digest it to myself and then kind of incorporate it. But I think I'm getting there. So to your question, Mario Larche and I had, it was an exciting kind of little project where we tried to generalize and decompose these three, I'll just call them benchmark channels, the partial, the conditional GE, and the size effects. So just by construction, these work always in opposite for the liberalizing country. They always work in the opposite direction. So when you liberalize, you trade more with the partner, and then through the trade diversion effects, of course, these gains from trade, ultimately, they are minimized. And we found through, this is mostly, empirical, anecdotal evidence. We don't have analytics, but we found that this second order effect, the trade diversion effects, account for about 30% of the initial partial effect. And then in our analysis of the TTIP, we figure out this is where this 20 to 50% came from, that once we took into account the diversion effects through the multilateral resistances, the partial effect was mitigated by 20 to 50%. And then once we endogenize size, even in an endowment setting, this effect accounted for about 10%, again, pushing the gains up. So there is no analytics behind this. This is just based on a lot of analysis in different settings. Well, for example, this is related when we did this dynamic gravity with endogenous country-specific capital accumulation, then there we found a magnifier of 60%. And this was related, and we can relate it to the capital share in production. So this is further endogenizing size. But that's where this number that I quoted came from.
Thanks. It's really, really cool. Yeah. So this is about gains or is it about fitting the data? That's where I guess we're confused. Is it about gains?
It was sure. I didn't present really welfare effects here. I decomposed the system in terms of trade effects, but the number that I referred to was for welfare effects.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Russ, over to you.
Yeah, Yoto, this is, it's really, you've done amazing things with all of this, and you have shown that services are also, fit a gravity pattern. But I wonder, what do you think about, the data that we observe in goods is just a relatively small part of the economy. And what do you think about this non-traded goods and how we should think about your framework in the context of haircuts and other things that are sort of not tradable?
Yeah, great. Great to see you, Russ. It's been a while. I hope we see each other in person. This is a great question. So I think part of the answer to this question is if we take gravity seriously, the theory is move to more disaggregated regional data. Now we have some examples of such data sets that partially will address your concerns, not of course haircuts, because I don't think that such data are available yet. And when it comes to to services in particular, we are working, I think this is complementary, and I really want to see Anton's paper. We are working on a paper where we extend the gravity framework to actually be able to estimate elasticities for relatively disaggregated services sectors, relying on theory and without the need to have tariff or price data. So what we do there is we exploit theory in order to generate an estimating equation where we obtain, and they can be disaggregated at any level and even country-specific elasticities for services trade within the kind of augmented gravity framework.
Tom, Frank's hand is up.
Okay, Frank van Tongeren, please.
Yeah, thanks. Wait a second. Let me put my television on as well, if I can. No, I can't. Yes, I can. Well, hello, everybody. Well, thank you very much, Yoto, for this very engaging talk. It was not only engaging, but also quite convincing. I have a question about incorporate the capacity of the structural gravity to say something about the effects of more domestic policies that have an impact on trade. So you mentioned already SPS and TBT. There are arguably different regulatory systems between countries lead to some trade costs. So I can see that. But now we also, I think, see a lot of movement in terms of certain domestic policies that try to stimulate certain sectors, so industrial policies. A lot of discussion around that right now in the getting out of this COVID and so on. So my question simply is, how could you say something about the capacity of this model, this type of models, to say something about this set of policies and their implications on trade? Because CGE models, I think, by their construction, can in principle say something about this already.
Yeah. Thank you, Frank. Great to see you as well. So yeah, I have a lot to say actually about this. Let's think about, I think, probably production subsidies is a good example. Now Roberta may be a little bit mad at me because, of course, these subsidies shouldn't be promoting exports, but we actually have some evidence that production subsidies are also kind of promoting exports disproportionately. So to your question, the model actually allows for identifying two related effects of such policies. One is the differential effect on export subsidies on international relative to internal trade, and to do this, we need domestic trade flows. So even if you have the exporter time fixed effects to fully control for the resistances, then you say, let me check whether the production subsidies promotes exports disproportionately relative to domestic trade. Yes, we can do this. And in fact, there are certain econometric benefits in terms of accounting for endogeneity of the policy, but this is just part of the effect, and we don't know whether this effect, like standards, promotes or impedes trade. So this is an empirical question. The second more important effect, which we now have tools to also identify within the same standard gravity equation in the presence of the structural multilateral resistances, is the uniform effect that this policy may have on international and on domestic sales. And this was, I think, the heart of your question. And my answer is yes, we can identify both effects. So at the end of the day, for production subsidies, for example, or SPSs or TBTs, we now have tools to identify the uniform and the differential. In other words, convert those into full tariff equivalents. And we are almost done with the draft. This is exactly the same paper that also recovers the trade elasticities for services, for example, which I know are of interest to the OECD as well. So I expect that this summer we're gonna finish it, and I'll be happy to share.
If only summer came. In Paris right now, it looks more like autumn already.
In Munich, it's still summer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great discussion. So please think about cross-cutting questions and broader implications. of this, all of these papers, while we turn it over to Roberta Piermantini to open as discussion opener. Roberta has been at the WTO for, I think, about 20 years. She's an economist, and she leads the group studying trade costs. So really a key person to have here. And Roberta's played an important role in translating what people like Kostas and Yoto do to a language that the negotiators can understand. And that's been key along the way. So Roberta, please, over to you. Share your take on this and open the discussion, if you would.
Hello, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Anton, for organizing this. And yes, this is 20 years because I think we met when I was coming to the board meeting about 20 years ago when it all started. And at the time at the WTO, we didn't have anything on gravity, nothing on CGE in-house. Life has changed significantly since then. Yoto gave a large contribution. We have started actually by working on gravity, doing training activities on gravities here, and then we published initially a book with UNCTAD, a guide, we call it, to trade policy analysis, because when at the time you started looking at gravity and wanted to do gravity, you realize there was nowhere where you could go and understand where you get the data. You actually specify everywhere it was going. It was not this solid theoretical backing. And then more recently with Yoto, we have the advanced guide to trade policy analysis. We do several training activities for researchers around the world based on this joint book on the gravity side. And we also have developed a CGE model, a corporate trade model, to provide projections on future trade, various scenarios. We have provided projections on the impact on COVID, the impact of trade war more recently, and that's pretty recent. But I mean, so there's a lot that in the last 20 years has happened, and a lot of lessons, I think, that we have learned. And so what I would like to do in this discussion on bridging the gap between CGE and new quantitative trade models is actually to add a bit of a policy perspective on how, for instance, new quantitative trade models can benefit also from the experience of the use of CGE, not only in adding elements, CGE and others, but also in policy, in getting a relevance and being relevant for policy making, so increasing their impact in policy making. So clearly, we see that in recent years we increasingly observe a move to more to the use of the quantitative trade models. These are sort of tend to be original model crafted by their authors, addressing specific questions, identifying new channels. And the key element I highlighted is the fact that their parameters are estimated within the model using a certain set of information, data, and on this is run a counterfactor. In CGE, instead are simulation models where parameters are taken from outside, but this is what policymakers are used to, is what has been used to estimate at the time of the Uruguay round the $500 billion gain, which never realized. That was one of the reasons why we were engaging in sort of improving communication with policymakers. And the other stuff is the analysis that we used for estimating the impact of the dollar round. But what, in my experience, and I tell you the story of my experience in there and what I think we should be doing now also with the new quantitative trade models is that at the start, I started working on CGE in a way to defend quantitative analysis from the sort of misbelief about anything a quantitative analysis would produce initially, because, for example, at the time of the beginning of the Doha round, there were several models with several features leading to different implications. Once we would get as that the best way to get most of from the Doha round would be to liberalize manufacturing. The second model will tell you would be liberalizing agriculture, and all correct within a model, all understandable by modelers, by giving message to policymakers that we basically don't really know much and we cannot really tell you much. The key is the difference are in the details, and these details often are very difficult to find. So I think the first lesson is that it's very important to correctly communicate what new quantitative trade models do, what they can do, and sort of limitations and advantages of the use of this model. And since they're coming up, there are a number of questions that if you want to have a policy impact, we need to sort of be clear of. So, I mean, there are questions like, is it important to understand what is the difference between CGE and new quantitative models? Do we get a better estimate? The fact that we claim that this is better because the parameters are estimated within the model, does it lead to better advice? Different type of questions, a better sense of the likelihood of the results compared to a CGE analysis. And if this is the case, let's give the likelihood of the results, which sometimes instead we tend to, like with CGE, to highlight a number. That's great. It goes in the newspapers. But what's the likelihood of the number? Can we attach a likelihood to that number? And the second set of element of questions and issues we need to think is how to correctly communicate results to policymakers. Now, it's useful to convey a sense of how results change depending on what goes into the model in terms of structure, in terms of how you assume elasticity to be constant or heterogeneous across firms. It is important to highlight the data requirements because that actually also leads to win-win outcomes. Because if you need data, and this we've seen it with Kyoto, we realize, oh, we need international trade data. And we sort of managed to engage resources to collect some type of data. So there can be a cooperation that is also a useful element. Then policy relevance. Sometimes when you do a study and you say, okay, the larger gains from trade because of this, that's relevant. But if you sort of formulate the questions into terms of, oh, the larger trade for gains and Brexit leads therefore to this much more loss, that is more policy relevant in a way, attracts more the attention of the policymakers. Adding element of realism is essential, like heterogeneity in elasticities, as we've seen today with Costa's work. Validation, obviously with Anton, some sort of getting a sense of how certain analysis perform compared to another one out of a sample prediction. So all these are elements that lead to a better policy impact. And Tom probably heard me saying this a lot because in the analysis of CGE, and we have been sort of trying to get into this increasing transparency in that. I think that's also what should be done from the beginning in the new quantitative model. And I just would like to conclude to highlight that Kostas, Anton, and Yoto brought us one step closer to higher credibility with policymakers. Kostas with more realism, Anton with validation analysis, and Yoto to clearly tell us what the limitations are, and it's the sky. And so with this, let me conclude and happy to discuss further.
Great, thanks, Roberta. I'd like to circle around through the authors first and let them kind of reflect on Roberta's comments, but generally on the session, and then we'll come around to the audience. While you're thinking, Kostas, Anton, and Yoto, how you want to respond, let me throw out a question that came to my mind. I can't resist the opportunity to ask that. Have you ever considered using the GTAP time series data for estimation purposes? So that's a data set that covers the entire world, that has the policies built in consistently. And actually, each time a new data set's released, they go back and rebuild the whole time series because methods have changed, sources of data. Nigeria's GDP may have changed by 50% at one point. So this is all rebuilt in a consistent way. I'm wondering whether you've ever considered on the new quantitative trade modeling side using the GTAP database for estimation purposes. That's something that maybe people haven't thought a lot about. It's not an annual time series, but it is a panel over more than a decade now. But anyway, let's circle back through the authors, the presenters, and in whatever order you like. Would you like to start, Kostas? Would you like to make a few remarks?
Yeah. I mean, I maybe say a word about Roberta's discussion. I mean, it's really good. You summarized things very well, but you also brought new issues. And I think your validation issue is, it's something that we should be thinking more in both for the CGE and the quantitative trade models. I'm trying to think about this stuff these days, but I think one of the big challenges here is that when you think about validation, is that there's not only one thing happening at a time, there are many things happening at a time. And the question is how to go from just thinking, like the simple R-square measures that I think are not appropriate because you have all these things happening at the same time, to kind of more sophisticated methods of validation. So that's one thing I want to bring up, and maybe we can discuss, or be food for thought. For the GTAP data, I'm just checking regularly. I think I haven't been able to use them, but I think it's kind of very useful to have the time series. Is there also, Tom, tell us, is there a domestic component, regional component? Can we eventually have within the country data, which is, I had thought about the GTAP data about that.
Yeah. There are efforts to build intra-national databases. Obviously, trade is a huge problem there. We really don't observe it. That becomes a lot more an exercise in estimation and imputation. So starting at the international level, I think, would be the most relevant. But yeah, it does strike me that there are many limitations to the databases that are currently being used. So I would encourage you to think about that anyway. And on the validation front, let me just throw out an idea, Kostas, before I go next to Anton, while you're thinking about Anton. Think about climate science. They have a similar problem, a similar challenge in lots of things changing at once. And validating their models, they look for footprints, they look for or fingerprints of particular, I think there's a lot to be learned from some other disciplines. And while I'm on the science side, working in that area, I've learned you don't even get to first base in publication without error bars and some discussion of validation. So I think there's a higher standard out there we should consider holding ourselves to in the future. Anton, would you like to make any remarks or responses to Roberta or the other authors' comments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Ro. So I like, so I'm learning, I've been learning from two presentations, also from Roberta. He's very detailed, her very detailed discussions on the policy linkage to the CGE and the gravity models. So I think, so I've been thinking about two kind of proposals in this relevant discussion. So one is that, so I think one time when I studied the demand system, I had the opportunity to Angus Deaton, who's a famous Nobel laureate. And so the question I asked him was, so I asked Professor Deaton if one time if you write another paper involving a new demand model, and what demand model? I knew that was a naive question. But I still want to ask to him. So what demand model are you going to use again, and what's going to be in your new paper? And Professor Deaton so answers the question like that. So he says, so I work backward. So before I choose the model, I tend to look at the data. What's the data availability, and from the availability of the data, characteristics of data, I choose the model. So I think this is all relevant to our question. So what's the communication? What's the passage between the CGE and gravity? And so CGE, obviously, especially GTAP, has in the past 20 years, or more than 20 years, has the huge advantage in collecting all these the data that I would think that the quantitative trade modelers will not necessarily have a deep understanding of what's been done in the data collection in terms of the GTAP efforts. So I would think that the data is the key at the moment to further bridge the gap between the two audience. The second proposal I had in mind is that in talking about Roberta's comments or question regarding how do we as quantitative trade modeler communicate with the policymakers, and how do we communicate with the CGE modeler? So I would think from the counterfactual. So if we start from the model, and it takes a long way for us to run and see, okay, so this is a model, and that's the model size that we want, and this is the data that we have. What's important is what we're really interested, no matter in gravity model or in CGE model, we're actually interested in the counterfactual consequences. So I would say that maybe instead of starting from choosing a model, why don't we look at the counterfactual equilibrium in different models chosen by different modelers? Because if we know the counterfactual equilibrium and know what's the counterfactual the model-driven counterfactual consequences with these structural parameters, which are needed, as Roberta said, the parameter estimation. Some are not just relevant in some of the counterfactual analysis. So these are the two proposals. And one quick thing I want to add is that before this conference, I had a conversation with Fareed Faroqi, who's an assistant professor at Department of Economics, Purdue. So he was hoping that we take initiative to to make more GTAP data more accessible to the audience. But one thing that I think I had a strong agreement with him that we both met the agreement is that I understand that GTAP is making a profit, and it's understandable we have resource. But my thought again with same consistent with Farid is that unless the GTAP can break totally the business operations business model with the GTAP data, it's difficult to completely bridge the gap between CGE and gravity in the sense of the GTAP efforts in the database.
Thanks, Anton. Very helpful comments, and yeah, we'll take that under advisement. I don't think that so GTAP is a not-for-loss operation. It's not a profit-maximizing operation. It's been going for almost 30 years because we don't make huge losses and can't just do one-offs. So, but I think there must be a way of making these data more widely available for people doing this kind of important scientific research. Yoto, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. So I have 3 reactions. First of all, again, thank you guys for organizing this great session. The presentations were wonderful as well, and I learned from them. So quickly, I'm gonna reiterate the importance that Roberta mentioned and Costas, and then you, Tom, about being able to validate our models, even in, ex-ante analysis, of course, that's not possible, but even ex-post analysis, because like Costas says, many things happen at the same time. We have to do better in order to see how good are our models. I think at this stage, maybe at least some horse race between certain flavors can be done, but this is an important and challenging task. Then two more comments related to what Roberta said. One is how believable are the numbers, and the other one was which model delivers better, and the other one was about attaching probability to these numbers. So my take on this is that, as we saw from Costas' presentation today, we now have very, very sound, sophisticated methods to estimate quite heterogeneous, disaggregated effects. To me, the structure of gravity framework, because as he said, those converge to different well-established models, their theory. I think that the structure of gravity framework is the glue that can take these sophisticated methods that Costas and co-authors are using and then translate them into CGE analysis that can be performed with GTAP. So again, just to reinforce what I said during the presentation, I think that there is a lot of learning that can be and exchanges that can happen between the GTAP literature, the structure of gravity, new estimating quantitative trait models, and this is why I think this session is important. How reliable are the numbers, whether we can attach likelihood? This was another important point that Roberta made. I think that this also reinforces the argument for estimation, because we know we are estimating these certain policies or elasticities or whatever we're interested in with certain confidence. So now we also have the tools to translate these partial equilibrium confidence intervals into general equilibrium confidence intervals. We know we have the tools, and the estimates are giving us the initial confidence interval. I think that this is important for two reasons. One, from an academic perspective, it is important because we can judge the significance of these GE effects, which often, especially on third countries, are small. And second, this is my personal experience. I know that when you give a policymaker a number, and once they go out with it in the paper, they don't want to change it. So my strategy has been to give them confidence interval. So when we later introduce new channels, then we have at least some leeway. Yeah, so I think this is a very important session, and thank you guys for organizing it.
Great, Yoto. Let's circle around the table and see whether there's others who want to chime in at this point. We have a few more minutes. And again, if you can come off mute and show your camera, then I think you pop up in front of me at least and wave, get my attention, or Zeynep's. But yeah, I agree with Yoto. This is a very important session. I could foresee one next year or the year after. Yoto, next year, Yoto and Kostas, this is in Kigali, Rwanda, so you could get some great travel miles in there and experience a wonderful new place. But I think it would be very exciting to see a paper that did blend the gravity, this nested approach, the gravity with some adding some of these other elements. Be great to see some estimation on the GTAP data set. Anton has done this for his CDE demand system. So he has estimated the CDE on the GTAP data. So then you have a set of parameters that are, based on this GTAP database and consistent. There are a number of issues that come in there in terms of consistency between the way the parameters are usually estimated and the way they're used in the model. So I think that's an example of how this can be used. But I do encourage you. So Anton could be, I think, for those of you, Yoto, Kostas, others who want to use the GTAP data in their model, Anton could help as a translator. Just the software is often a barrier. We can overcome the paywall. That's not a big issue if you don't have the budget to buy the data. I'm sure we can overcome that. My view on the data front, as I said, there are a lot of one-off efforts out there, and personally, I'm happy to pay people who are going to spend their time building data or software or anything else. I love the open source concept, but continuity is even better. So, but we'll certainly overcome that. If Anton sees that as an issue, if that's an issue, we'll overcome that for sure to advance this really important area of work. Russ, did you want to chime in?
So I've been thinking about this question of NQT and CGE and gravity and how are they different and things like that. And I think, one thing that the NQT literature maybe it's just a maturity thing, but the one reason that GTAP and other CG models have purchased with policymakers is that they've seen them before. And so when you talk to a policymaker and you say, I'm using GTAP, you have to educate them once or two or three times on what is GTAP. But then if you use GTAP the next time, they kind of know how to think about GTAP. And, NQT models, because they're in academia, everybody's trying to do something new and change it. And so I think it's kind of hard to kind of directly get to policymakers that way. And sort of it struck me in Yoto's talk that what Yoto's doing is really kind of branding gravity. In a sense that, if policymakers have seen his work, a few times, they begin to understand how it works and maybe even what the limitations might be, et cetera. But, you can kind of see, I think what Yoto is doing is sort of building that brand of gravity-based analysis for policymakers, so that you can go back to the policymaker with the next policy scenario and say, okay, I'm using a model that you know about, and here's what the model says about this policy scenario. So I think, the problem, if there's a problem with sort of NQT models not being sort of used as much by policymakers, part of that is just that there isn't this kind of basic framework, and I think Yoto has got kind of has shown us how that can be done a little bit in terms of gravity.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Yoto. Obviously, you've had an impact on Roberta's thinking. And that's
size matters, guys.
Yeah, well, I think it's about time to wrap up. I do want to go around one more time and thank the speakers for getting up so early. East Coast, that's probably Kostas. Yoto may be in Munich, which is a little easier, and Anton. But thanks for Anton organizing. Kostas, thanks for bringing your terrific ideas and intellect to this community and really showing us how we can free ourselves from very simplistic, overly simplistic assumptions and move into a more realistic empirical world. I think that's important. Anton for championing the non-homotheticity, showing the way forward on that and bridging with the GTAP data and just making this effort to bridge between the two. And Yoto's enthusiasm, I think, for this work and for reaching out. I think, Yoto, I really appreciate that willingness to reach out and bridge with other communities. I think that's important. So let's keep this going, Anton. You've got the energy and email capability to keep this dialogue going. And let's hope for another session next year that moves this one step ahead. And I hope to see you all in Kigali.